All right, everyone, it's 4 o'clock on the nose, so let's get started. Welcome to the April program of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. I'm Glenda Bullock, the program chair of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, and our speaker today is Adrian Miller. He's going to be discussing his new book, Black Smoke: African Americans and the United States of Barbecue. We've been looking forward to this talk for a long time. Our online host for today's program is, as always, the Ann Arbor District Library, which is providing tech support for us on Zoom, and we are streaming the program on the library's YouTube channel today. By now, I think we're all pretty familiar with how Zoom works, but if you don't want your face to be seen on the recording, please turn off your video. Your microphones will be muted. We do have chat turned on for this talk, though. So if you have questions, you can put them in chat. Make sure that you select not everyone, but down at the bottom where there's the chat button. Over at the side, don't select everyone, but select Ann Arbor District Library as where you should direct your questions. And then we'll be taking questions at the end of the program as time allows. One more tip: at the top right of your screen is a button that says View, and you will want to click Speaker View instead of Gallery View for your best viewing experience. And before introducing our speaker, we always give a quick introduction to the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. We're an informal group of people who are interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. We have monthly talks between September and May, usually on the third Sunday of the month at the Mallett's Creek branch of the Ann Arbor District Library. And we hope to be able to be back there once it's safe to do so. We have 2 participatory theme meals every year, although those are temporarily on hold. They're fun, they're informative, they are always a gastronomic adventure. Our membership is $25 a year for an individual or a family, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine Repast, which is edited by Randy Schwartz. I'm holding up a copy of the current issue, which is beginning a 3-part series on English culinary history. So if you're interested in becoming a member of the CHAA, you can find information on our website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and click on membership. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Adrian Miller is a food historian, attorney, soul food scholar, and certified barbecue judge from Denver, Colorado. He's the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, and Adrian previously served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton with his Initiative for One America, which was the first freestanding office in the White House to address issues of racial, religious, and ethnic reconciliation. He's also been a board member of the Southern Foodways Alliance. His first book, Soul Food: The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time, won the James Beard Foundation Award for Scholarship and Reference in 2014. His second book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet: The Story of the African Americans Who Have Fed Our First Families, From the Washingtons to the Obamas, was published on President's Day in 2017. In 2018, Adrian was awarded the Ruth Vertel Keeper of the Flame Award by the Southern Foodways Alliance in recognition of his work on African American foodways. In June of 2019, he lectured in the Masters of Gastronomy program at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Palenzo, Italy. And his third book, Black Smoke: African Americans and the United States of Barbecue, is being released next week, and that is why we are so pleased to have him with us today. Welcome, Adrian Miller.
Thank you, Glenda, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor and the Ann Arbor District Library for hosting me today. So what I'm going to do is just basically go through the structure of my book and give you the journey, tell you why I wrote this book, and then kind of go through the chapters. And then at the end, I look forward to your questions, because I know that barbecue can lead to a lot of fights, and that I kind of actually enjoy that. So I'm really interested to see what you think about African-American barbecue and kind of the things that I bring up. So I'm going to share my screen here and take you through my PowerPoint. So let's get that started. All right, so you're getting a little bit of a preview, as Glenda said, because the book comes out next Tuesday. Um, and so that's me in one of my favorite barbecue joints in Denver, Colorado. And I know when you heard that I was from Denver, I probably lost all street cred on the subject of barbecue, but let me win you back. My parents are from the South. My mom's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad's from Helena, Arkansas. So Southern barbecue was definitely part of my tradition growing up. And so this was a place that's called Boney's Barbecue. And unfortunately, the COVID pandemic caught up to Boney's and they recently closed. I'm really sad, but just shows you how serious I am about barbecue. One other thing, you are highly encouraged to do social media as I go through this presentation. So on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, I make it really easy. If you do Soul Food Scholar, you're gonna find me. So please, if you wanna show brothers some love, do some social media. And if you wanna say something negative, just hold on to that. There's really no reason that you actually have to post something. So just to, before I get to it, let me just give you a little bit about my writing journey and how I got to the subject of barbecue. So what started me off in writing about Southern food was really a book that I came across by John Edgerton called Southern Food at Home, on the Road in History. And I read that book in the late 2000s. And in that book, Mr. Edgerton wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cookery had yet to be written. So I was really fascinated by that sentence. So I reached out to him and I asked him if anybody had really, done that tribute, because the book was about 14 years old when I picked it up. And he said, nobody's really done it, and there's always room for another voice, so why not yours? And I thought, okay. So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that launched me on the journey to write Soul Food, the Surprising Story of an American Cuisine. And in that book, what I did is I created a representative soul food meal, and I wrote a chapter about every part of the meal, and I explained what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, and what it meant for the culture. Now, in the research for that book, I read about 3,500 oral histories of formerly enslaved people, looking for all references about soul food. I read thousands of newspaper and magazine articles that have been digitized thanks to companies like ProQuest, which I think might be based in Ann Arbor. But ProQuest, the Library of Congress, and other companies have really done a great job of digitizing these sources. Talked to hundreds of people about what they thought the cuisine was. And then also, because I was so dedicated to my craft, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities and 15 states. If you were my social media friend, I brought you along for the ride and basically showed you where are the places I went and the food that I was going to eat. Now, one of the smartest things that I ever did was while I was researching the soul food book, I actually spent extra time starting to research barbecue. So I definitely had a lot of barbecue places in my time. And I'd say by the time I got to writing this book, I hit over 200 barbecue places across the country, and actually a few in Canada as well. There's African Americans doing barbecue in Canada as well. So won the James Beard Award for that book. And then the research for that soul food book led to my book on African Americans in the White House. But enough with my writing journey. Let's talk about why we're here today. All right, we're here to talk about Black Smoke, and let me tell you about the birth of a barbecue, how I got this idea and the birth of a book on African American barbecue. So in roughly 2004, I saw a commercial on the Food Network for something called Paula's Southern Barbecue, and this is Paula Deen's. And it was an hour-long show on barbecue, and I was watching this show, and by the time the credits rolled, there were no African Americans who had been featured on screen. And this really bothered me. And I thought, well, first of all, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe it was Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue. But no, in fact, it was Paula Deen's Southern barbecue. And I just thought to myself, well, how does this even happen? Because barbecue was such a big part of my experience, even though I lived outside the South. And then having spent a lot of time in the South, I knew that African-American barbecue was a prominent part of the culture and that African-Americans had made significant contributions. So I started looking around in food media, and what I found was a very disturbing trend. Now, let me back up and say, it's very easy to put all the blame on Paula Deen. I actually don't do so because she's the talent, and a few times in my life, I've been the talent in some TV shows, and I know how it works. So I think it's really more about the production company that put together this show, because often they're the ones who do the research, they identify the spots, and they figure out how the story is going to be told. And as I started looking at other examples of media, not only in film, TV, but also print, I just saw that there was a big trend towards pushing African Americans so much to the sidelines of barbecue, to its margins, that African American presence and contributions to barbecue were being vanished. So how it started, if you go back before, I would say before the 1990s, but let's just go back to the 1800s. Most of the depictions of barbecue were like this one from Harper's Weekly. Now, this is a scene that's taken from the basically a big exposition that happened in Atlanta in 1895. It was very popular. It was called the Atlanta Exposition. It was very popular, and it was written about in a lot of newspapers and magazines, and just featured very prominently. So let's zoom in here and look. So basically, up until very recently, at least until the 20th century, Southern barbecue was this. It was digging a trench, filling that trench up with hardwood coals that were burned down. They were burned down to coals, and then essentially whole animal cooking. Now, it wasn't always pigs. It could be a lamb. It could also be cows, but cows are really big, so they would cut that in quarters. So a lot of whole animals, and possum, a lot of animals were cooked this way. And so essentially the animals that were cooked were butchered, cleaned, and then processed in a way that they were butterflied, and then poles were stuck into the side. So essentially that people could do this kind of work. So barbecue was very labor intensive. And so there's a lot going on in this picture that's really pertinent to the barbecue story. First of all, we see that the workers, the people actually doing the work, are African American. And I'll explain a little bit later why that happens. And then we see on the right, if you look on your right-hand side, you see a group of white people just kind of, observing, because it was a spectacle, right? To see this work being done, to see barbecue as a production. And then we see some African American men in the background making the side dishes. I'm given what I know about barbecue and Southern barbecue at that time, they're probably making something called Brunswick stew, which was a kind of a vegetable and meat stew. Early versions of it were squirrel, but later on it was chicken. And, it wasn't always men who were doing the side dishes. And a lot of accounts that we have of Southern barbecue in the 1800s, essentially it was African-American women who were often in charge of that. But the reason why African Americans are so associated with this kind of barbecue is because it's labor intensive. And the racial etiquette of the time was that if you had a lot of work to be done and you didn't want to compensate the workers, you'd have enslaved African Americans do it. And so we'll see a little bit later, by the time you get to the mid 1800s, African Americans and barbecue are pretty much wedded. The only thing that's missing from this is we don't have basically, we call them pitmasters now, which is a cringeworthy term, but essentially what we would call a barbecue superintendent. And so it would be a white man who was actually kind of overseeing everything, but actually the African Americans were doing the work. All right, now let's go to this next slide here. And we get to this. And so this is a Bon Appetit. It wasn't the cover story, but it was a main feature in the article. And in this article, essentially it says who's who in American barbecue, and it has this nice backyard badminton, backyard barbecue scene. People are playing croquet, badminton. So let's zoom in on this one as well. And I want you to take a moment and tell me if you see any African Americans. Right, none. We see an Asian guy in the middle with the beach ball. We've got a woman, but pretty much the rest of the scene here are white dudes who barbecue. And that's really getting to the heart of what I'm talking about here. So the question is, how do we go from that scene in 1895 to that other scene in 2003? That's why I wrote Black Smoke. Black Smoke is part celebration and part restoration. So the celebration part is to, just give a shout out to the various aspects of African-American barbecue culture. And the restoration part is to essentially show that African-Americans have made significant contributions to barbecue in the United States, and to exclude African-Americans from any barbecue story in this country is just simply whack or, crazy. So the structure of the book is I go through various aspects of Black barbecue culture, and I include some recipes in each chapter. But the thing that I loved is I was able to find different people throughout history who I thought their story really evoked the themes of a particular chapter. And so I'll give you some highlights there. I'm not going to give you all of the great stories because I want you to buy the book, of course. All right. The first thing I do after stating this problem in the introduction is I talk about the Native American Foundation. So one thing that had always bothered me about kind of the story of barbecue's backstory that's often told is that usually it's Europeans come to the Caribbean, they see the indigenous people in the Caribbean doing a type of cooking they've never really seen before. Eventually they call it barbecue in English, barbacoa in Spanish. Um, and then eventually Europeans who move to the mainland North America bring that type of cooking and also European animals, namely pigs, cows, sheep. And that's where barbecue was born in the South. The thing that's always bothered me about that narrative was twofold. One, it presumes that Native Americans on the mainland of what would be called North America didn't have their own meat cooking traditions. And the second thing is what emerges as Southern barbecue, what I just showed you, is not the way, there's no depiction of that happening in the Caribbean. So there must be something else going on. So that's what I was wondering. So I went back through a lot of European journals of people traveling through the South and what they observed of Native Americans. Now, the caveat here is barbecue history is very hazy. There's not a lot written about this. And unfortunately, a lot that's written or drawn about early barbecue gets it wrong because people had agendas or they weren't very careful about what they noted. So, I'm just giving you my best educated guess on the available sources. So there were 5 kind of types of meat cooking that were observed. One is piercing sticks. So the idea here is that an animal is killed, usually game, deer, venison, and then pieces of meat were put on sticks in a couple of various ways. One is this kind of lattice pattern that you see here. So it was a framework, and the sticks were put in the ground, and then they were kind of tilted towards the fire or back, depending on how fast you wanted to cook the meat or get a smoke flavor on the meat. Other times there was a long stick with a morsel of meat on the very tip planted in the ground, and the weight of the morsel bent the stick towards the fire, and that was another way to cook. So you had the piercing, what I call the piercing sticks method. Another one is the rotating spit. Now this would have been very familiar to Europeans because essentially that's how they were cooking, although they were using metal by the time that they had gotten to the Americas. Another type is the raised platform. Now, the raised platform is what was observed in the Caribbean. And essentially, these are 4 sticks with kind of a fork in them put in the ground. And then a lattice pattern of other sticks were created to create this platform. And that way you could lay fish, iguanas, small animals, vegetables, fruit, whatever you were going to cook, you could lay on that raised platform. Now, this is a little bit of an overemphasis on the fire here, because usually it was a very slow fire. And from the accounts of Europeans who were watching this type of cooking, sometimes it would take a couple days to do this, to smoke this meat. And you have to remember, barbecue was often for preservation purposes, not necessarily for immediate feasting. Another is the earth oven. Now, earth ovens are all over the world. And the typical earth oven is you dig a vertical hole, and at the bottom of that hole, you would put your fuel source, and usually there were rocks or something else added in order to retain the heat. And then you would layer vegetation, the meat you want to cook, until you got to the ground level, and then you would either bury it or cover it up and then let it cook overnight. And then the idea, and that's to protect it from predators and other things. And then the idea is that the next morning you would come and you would eat that food. So this earth oven is getting much closer to what we call Southern barbecue, right? You could see the seeds of an idea of a pit here. And if you're familiar with the Latino barbecue cultures like barbacoa in South Texas, you can tell that this is very much that type of cooking. But then there's also observations of shallow pits. And so this is a hybrid picture because this is really closer to what we call Southern barbecue. But essentially, you would have not quite as deep as an earth oven, but something intermediary where a depression was made in the ground. You'd put your fuel source there, burn it down. And I think often it was a mixture of wood and rocks, again, for the idea of retaining heat. And then there were some times where the meat was just laid right on the rocks and coals to cook. And there were other times that dry wood or green wood that wouldn't burn so quickly was laid over to create another kind of gridiron look to create, so that the meat can be laid on that. So eventually Europeans take their kind of faster grilling meat cooking techniques and they graft it onto what Native Americans were doing. And that starts to build momentum to what we identify as Southern barbecue later. Initially, Native Americans and enslaved Native Americans were the earliest cooks of this form of new barbecue that was kind of created. But once Indian slavery wasn't going to work out, and when European slaveholders transitioned to African slavery, then we start to see the imprint of African Americans on this. I argue that mostly it was on seasoning, and then later just the honed experience in cooking this kind of meat that eventually leads to African Americans being the go-to cooks for barbecue. And it was really, this all happens in Virginia. And then it was Virginia barbecue that gets transplanted in other parts of the South and eventually gets called either Southern barbecue or the barbecue of the new place. But pretty much all the cooking in the 18th century when it came to barbecue was pretty much the same way. Okay, so by the time we get to 1839, this is a newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, printed in 1839. By the time you get to this point in US history, African Americans are wedded with barbecue. And so I just want to read the first part of this newspaper article. And it says, a friend who was a native of Virginia has furnished us with the following account of a manager of arranging a barbecue at the South. An agreeable and retired place is selected near some spring and pleasant grove. On the previous day, some favorite Negro man of reputation for skill and experience in the business is sent up with his assistants, who proceed to make a kiln or pit of stones. So in essence, this is saying that African Americans, usually enslaved, are integral to the cooking process. These are the people that you want cooking this type of food. And this builds momentum over time, and essentially enslaved African Americans and their descendants become barbecue's go-to cooks. Now, this is not to argue for exclusivity. Of course, anybody can cook barbecue, and a lot of people do end up cooking barbecue. But the argument here is that the conventional wisdom was that the very best barbecue and the very best barbecue cooks were African Americans. And if you were going to have authentic Southern barbecue, you would hire an African American from the South to do that. And so enslaved African Americans become barbecue's most effective ambassadors. In addition to making this barbecue in the South, a lot of people get a hankering for barbecue around the country. And so after emancipation, African Americans are put on trains, boats, stagecoaches, you name it, to bring a taste of Southern barbecue to other areas. Now, the reason why I think barbecue becomes so popular and becomes one of the featured foods at big public events during the 18th and 19th centuries is because it's scalable. As long as you found an open area big enough and you had enough labor to pull it off, and you had enough animals, to cook and feed everybody, you could have massive crowds. So by the 1820s and 1830s, we get reports of barbecues that have 20 to 30,000 people. Now, I don't know if these numbers are accurate because they didn't have satellite technology back then, that can help you actually count the people. So, but the idea is that these were massive endeavors. And so barbecue becomes a very important part of African-American culture during this time. And and just to show you how much Blackness was equated with barbecue, pretty much from start to finish, it was a Black experience for whites. So you would have African Americans cooking the food, you would have African Americans serving the food, and then after the barbecue, whites would watch African Americans either sing spirituals or do dances or play games. And that was all part of the entertainment experience. And it was only after all the white people had finished eating and that was, all the entertainment was done, that African Americans got to partake of the cooking. And one thing to understand with these huge barbecues with thousands and thousands of people, it wasn't like barbecue today where, you walk into a place, you're like, oh, I think I want a pound of brisket. Give me a couple of ribs, a chicken. Now, you basically got a hunk of meat and some coffee and some bread, and you just kept it moving. That was kind of the idea with barbecue back then. All right, so after I kind of talk about the momentum that barbecue gets in African-American cultures, I talk about how it's rooted in slavery. Essentially, barbecue expands with slavery. When slaveholders leave Virginia to go to other parts of the emerging South and what they called the West at that point, which would have been the outer South, it was typically barbecue was brought to those places because the slaveholders moving to the new place brought their labor with them. and usually I had barbecues as part of the culture. So even in Kentucky, if they had a big barbecue in the early years, instead of calling it a Kentucky barbecue, they would call it Virginia barbecue happening in Kentucky. So this happens in Kentucky, West Tennessee. A lot of West Tennesseans then go to Missouri and also East Texas, and so that is tied to the spread of barbecue. But when African Americans barbecue on their own terms, a lot of times it was to celebrate emancipation, also political barbecues, and I do a whole chapter on church barbecue because I don't know what the connection is between preaching the word of God and smoking meat, but it definitely exists in African American culture. And let me just admit something. My own journey in barbecue has been very distracting to my spiritual life because I'm part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church tradition. And when I study scripture, the story of the burning bush, I wondered, did it smell like hickory, mesquite, maybe oak? The story about the Valley of Dry Bones, did it look like spare ribs? So I know that I need counseling, but that's just my problem. So I do a whole chapter on church barbecue. Here's an example of an African Methodist church ad in all places in Minnesota. And this is just an ad for barbecue. And I just want to show you that, hey, it's showing this African American. He's cooking actually beef, not pork. And it's talking about Southern barbecue and all that kind of stuff. So I just love the message that it sends. And then also on the right-hand side of your screen, one of the stories that I tell is a beloved figure from Denver, Colorado. His name is Daddy Bruce Randolph Sr. He lived to be 94 years old. He died in the 1990s, but he was a legend in Denver. And he wasn't clergy, but he was a lay person. And I include him because he ran a beloved barbecue joint. But then every Thanksgiving, he would feed thousands of people for free. And he actually got national attention for this. He was featured in the New York Times and the LA Times and in newspapers all across the country. So I tell his story. And plus, look, isn't that just a wonderful smile? Isn't that the kind of guy you just want to get to know? And then after I talk about church barbecue, and let me just say this about church barbecue as well. In the 1800s, with all of these massive crowds that were being built, two kind of leaders figured out that barbecue was a great way to get a lot of people to show up: politicians and clergy. So in the church barbecue context, it was these things called camp meetings. And then for politicians, it was just basically political rallies. And what happens is, because African Americans are asked to do this type of cooking, they get a distinct advantage over everyone else when it comes to barbecuing. So that by the time you get to post-emancipation, you actually have a number of highly skilled specialists who can leverage their status in the market and actually make some money for what they do. And so I tell the story of those people as they emerge from slavery and have some freedom and can go out and make some money. Because again, the reputation is that African Americans made the best barbecue. So one of the figures that I show is this guy named Columbus B. Hill. And he is from Missouri. He shows up in Denver, Colorado in the 1870s. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, dude, is this book all about Denver people? No, but I'm the author, and so I just picked who I wanted to highlight. But the reason why I highlight Columbus Hill is because, unlike so many other African-American barbecuers of his time, this guy was extensively covered and interviewed. So we actually have quotes from him. We have people observing him cooking. And so that full example is just not something I've seen in other places. So that's why I'm featuring him. But he shows up in Denver in the 1870s. And then by the 1880s, he's cooking barbecues for 5,000, 10,000 people. In 1890, when the state capitol in Colorado, the cornerstone for the building was laid, he does a barbecue for 25,000 people right in front of the Colorado State Capitol. And then by the end of the decade, he does a barbecue for 30,000 people. But that was accidental because it was only supposed to be for 5,000 people, VIPs. But the word got out in the seedy part of Denver. All these people showed up and there was a barbecue riot. This plays out in the front pages of the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News and all the media of that time. But just another example of these barbecue. The last time we hear about Columbus Hill is in the 1900s, and he does a barbecue for the Navy fleet and the Pacific, which was docking in Seattle. So his reputation was so widespread that he actually gets on a train and heads to Seattle. So he's one of the characters that I came across and I share in my book. Share a story. And then I talk about the entrepreneurs. In many cases, African Americans, some of these who are freelancers, actually go to a place and stay. So instead of just popping in, doing a barbecue and heading out, they stay in a community and get known for barbecue. So on the left, you have Henry Perry, who is acknowledged as the father of Kansas City barbecue. He shows up in the early 1900s. He's from West Tennessee as well. Now he's a kind of like a hotel worker and a porter early, but then eventually he starts running a barbecue stand in an alley. And one thing I love about this is, he called himself the barbecue king. And one thing you're going to find is in the 1800s on, you have a lot of self promotion. So there are a lot of barbecue kings walking around, as many as Saudi Arabian princes and Nigerian princes. So, a lot of people wanted to call themselves the barbecue king. And in fact, even when he was calling himself that in Kansas City, there was another guy who claimed he was the barbecue king. But the other thing I like to highlight is just look at the different, the variety of meat that is on the menu there. So it's not the standard just pork, right? He's got all kinds of game, beef, again, mutton, sheep. So it just shows you the variety of the barbecue palette. And then on the right hand side is a woman named Ernestine Vandeval, who lived in the community of Nicodemus, Kansas. If you don't know the story of Nicodemus, Kansas, it is one of the earliest all Black communities started in this country, started by what they called exodusters. So these were African Americans who fled the South right after slavery and after emancipation, and started their own community. So this was a farming community. It still exists to this day, although it's much smaller in stature and size, but it's a great community. And she was there, she grew up there, and she moved to Pasadena as a young woman, Pasadena, California, and started a soul food and barbecue joint that was highly regarded. Evidently, Walt Disney loved her food. But later in life, she returned to Nicodemus and ran a barbecue restaurant there, put out a cookbook. And to this day, her niece, Angela Bates, has been really strong in keeping her legacy going. And every summer, they have a homecoming celebration where people who used to live in Nicodemus come back. We're talking about people in their 80s and 90s coming back, and anybody can join. So imagine going to this really fun family reunion and anybody can be there. Angela Bates is still out there making barbecue at Ernestine's barbecue joint. So I wanted to tell the story of both men and women, because African-American women have been in the barbecue game for the longest time. So this kind of heavily male-dominated idea that you have a barbecue really does not play out in the Black community. I also do a chapter on African-American barbecue aesthetic, because often people ask me, what's the difference between white barbecue and Black barbecue? In fact, I got asked that question by the famous author, John Grisham, we were doing an event, and I told him about my book, and he was pretty incredulous about it. And he just asked, well, what's the difference between Black barbecue and white barbecue? And I said, Black barbecue tastes better. Of course, I'm just joking, kind of. But, people ask me, well, what are the differences? And I say that essentially, and we're going to get into more detail in a moment, but African-American barbecue tends to have a certain list of items that people expect, tends to be cooked hot, fast, and slow, not low and slow like you often hear. And there's a little bit more char. The meat tends to be less butchered. So all of these things come together to kind of, and more funky cuts of meat and things like that come together in barbecue. And then also sauce. Now, African Americans love barbecue sauce. In fact, I can't tell you how many people, when I was interviewing folks around the country, said, look, anybody can cook meat. It's really how you make your sauce. And the sauce is usually the calling card. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you have an editorial cartoon that was in the Kansas City Star when Arthur Bryant, a legendary barbecuer in Kansas City, died in 1982. That is St. Peter at the pearly gates. And the question he asked Arthur Bryant is, did you bring the sauce? On the left-hand side of your screen, this is an ad from an Atlanta newspaper in like 1910-ish. And what's interesting is, the dignity that's afforded to this African-American cook, because in this instance, he's portrayed as an expert, a person who knows what he's doing. And I'm kind of surprised that we didn't get more kind of Aunt Jemima, Rostis, Uncle Ben characters emerge from commercial barbecue products like we do in other areas because of the strong identification of African-American excellence in barbecue, but it just never happens. This is the closest we get as far as I've seen. So, and just to show you the importance of sauce, I've been to restaurants where you order your barbecue and the plate comes and it's just like an ocean of sauce with little islands of meat poking up. So that just shows you how important sauce is to African-American barbecue tradition. Then I do a chapter on competition barbecues. You don't see a lot of African-Americans on the competition circuit. In this chapter, I give you my thoughts as to why. I think it's mainly economic. And a lot of people don't know this, but Memphis in May, which is one of the most famous barbecue competitions in the world, was at the very first year in 1978. It was actually won by an African-American woman, this woman pictured here. A lot of people don't know that. And she won that with a very minimal setup. And that was before competition barbecue got so corporate, where you have to spend a lot of money in it. And this bears out over time. With some of the high profile contests, you don't see a lot of African-Americans, but in cities where there's some kind of barbecue contest that's low cost, you see a lot more African-American representation in those contests. So that's why I think it's mainly an economic thing. I also do a profile of Sylvie Curry. She's known as the Lady of Q. She's one of the most recognizable African-Americans on the competition circuit, and certainly one of the most recognizable African-American women. She's a remarkable woman because she pretty much does all of this herself. And she will just tell you, look, I just don't like a lot of people, messing around while I'm trying to do my thing. Even her husband knows just to kind of get out of the way when she's locked in for a barbecue contest. But if you don't know about her, on Netflix, there's something called the American Barbecue Showdown. It debuted a few months ago. She is part of that competition, and I'm not going to be a spoiler, but I think you will be very impressed with a lot of the food that she made. So let's quickly go through African-American influenced regional styles. This is all part of the aesthetic. You've got the Carolinas. And so, Carolinas really is an extension, or at least a heritage from Virginia barbecue, because it's pretty much made the same way. And it's usually chopped pork, and it could be whole hog or pork shoulder that is flavored with a vinegar and red pepper kind of sauce. That's the earliest barbecue sauce. And then there's usually some kind of slaw and hush puppies that are part of that meal. So that picture is taken from a place called Grady's Barbecue in Dudley, North Carolina. It's an older African-American couple in their 70s making great next level barbecue. So who knows how much longer they're going to be doing it. I encourage you to stop by if you can. And then there's something I call Deep South barbecue, which is mainly like focused on pork. So it's going to be chopped pork, usually pork shoulder, barbecue ribs, and then also Southern side dishes. So you'll have greens, you'll have mac and cheese, coleslaw, potato salad, those kind of things. More styles influenced by African-Americans. Memphis. Now, Memphis is known for ribs and other things, but I think one of the quintessential kind of Memphis foods is this chopped pork sandwich. So this is a chopped pork sandwich from Payne's Barbecue. I think this is the Platonic form of pork sandwiches. So that's a pork sandwich with a mustard slaw. I don't find mustard slaw in many places. I got to tell you, it's amazing. And then also Chicago. Now, south side of Chicago does not get much love when it comes to barbecue styles, but they have a style all their own. This is a picture from a place, and why I chose this picture is because essentially they're using a special type of cooker called an aquarium smoker. And it's something you really only see in a few places, and mainly in Southside Chicago. And Southside Chicago, it's rib tips, hot links, chicken, and then some fries. And sometimes all of that is wrapped up, drenched in sauce, maybe a little white bread thrown on, and then it's served to you. But that's Chicago Southside barbecue, and it should have its own recognition as a regional style. East Texas. Now, when people say Texas barbecue, they all gravitate to the center. Austin, the Hill Country, all in environs. But the earliest form of Southern barbecue shows up in East Texas, because that's where slaveholders first landed. And so we have accounts of African Americans doing barbecue in the 1830s. And so East Texas doesn't get much love. And much like other Texas barbecue, there's an emphasis on beef and pork. So this is a place the top picture is from a place called Patillo's. And Patillo's is one of the oldest barbecue joints in the world. We don't know exactly when it opened, but it might be 1911 or 1912. It's African-American owned, so it's one of the oldest African-American owned barbecue joints. And you see that there's chopped beef with the kind of a rich dark brown gravy. Beautiful stuff. Kansas City. Kansas City is interesting because it's kind of a mixture of several different regional styles. But this is from Gates Barbecue, one of my favorite barbecue places. And so on this plate, you've got some spare ribs, you've got some sliced pork, and you've got fries and pickles and all kinds of goodness going on. And Gates, by the way, is my favorite commercial barbecue sauce. All right, so what would I say are African-American barbecue specialties? So one is pork spare ribs. And I think pork spare ribs is the through line through almost every region of the country where African Americans are. And typically, the African American spare ribs are not going to, in terms of barbecue spare ribs, are usually going to be less butchered. So instead of that St. Louis cut where the rib tip is cut off, it's actually going to have the rib tips attached. So that's typically what you're going to find in African American joints. And then chopped pork, you see in a lot of places. Chicken. Barbecue chicken, and it shows up in various ways, but that's usually something you see. And then hot link sausages. And so the hot link sausages in African-American places are usually going to be coarsely chopped and very spicy. So those, I would say, are the main features in African-American barbecue. And then you see rib tips. That really starts in Chicago, kind of in the 1950s, but then it spread in popularity. In Kentucky, there's something called Monroe County pork steaks. And actually, not only in Kentucky, but in St. Louis, Missouri, parts of Illinois, you'll see pork steaks as a popular barbecue option. And that's something that I've seen in a lot of African-American joints. In Memphis, they've got some funky stuff going on in Memphis. So there's something called barbecue bologna. And the way you make barbecue bologna is they get the tube of a barbecue, they stab slits in it, put it on the smoker for a few hours. And then when you order your barbecue bologna sandwich, they'll take that off the smoker and then cut like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick slice of bologna, put it on some white, and they'll put it on the grill to char it a little bit, put it on some white bread, add some sauce, some slaw if you want, and then that's your sandwich. It's awesome. Another cool thing is barbecue spaghetti. If you've never heard of barbecue spaghetti, imagine instead of marinara sauce, you have a seasoned kind of barbecue-based mixture, and you toss your noodles in that and you add grilled meat. Awesome. And then I don't care what anybody in Texas tells you, burnt ends are not from Texas. They are from Kansas City. This man, Arthur Bryan, who I mentioned earlier, is the one who created burnt ends. And burnt ends really started out as a snack that was given away to people after, instead of throwing it away, because when you trim the brisket there, you create these odd bits and pieces. Rather than throwing that away, Arthur Bryant decided to put it in a container and put it on the counter, and customers would munch on these while they were waiting for their order to be filled. And so the early this is what burnt ends really looked like in the early days. It was basically shards of meat, really crispy and fatty. It's not the perfect cubes that are Instagrammable that you see today, okay? So that's the story of burnt ends. So why did it, now in the next chapter, I just say, okay, so basically you've seen this rich history, you see all that's going on in African-American culture. Why is it that barbecue media has fallen deeply in love with white dudes who barbecue? And I argue that there are 4 kind of archetypes here. So you've got the competition guy, you've got the Bubba guy, kind of the guy from the rural South. You've got the hipster type, with interesting facial hair, tattoos, glasses, all that kind of stuff. And then you've got the fine dining chef. Much love to anybody who pursues barbecue, but I'm just saying that the barbecue media has gravitated towards these types of people. And the question is why? I argue it's because of foodies. So in the late 1980s and 1990s, you get the emergence of a group of people that we call foodies now, who are intensely interested in food. They've got disposable income. They're willing to travel. And they're just looking for somebody to tell them, hey, what is good barbecue and where can I get it? And so in order to serve this rising group of people, and let me just back up and say, there have always been people interested in food. But if you look at food media, they they tended to cater to wealthy people who were interested in food. So the gourmet magazines and other really were aiming at kind of an upper class market. But now you've got a lot of middle class folks, and a lot of them interested in food. And so there's a commensurate rise in food media. So the Food Network is launched in 1993. You're getting more magazines and print media, cookbooks, and other things that are paying attention to barbecue. And even publications like Gourmet, Bon Appetit, and others start increasing their barbecue coverage. They always used to have like some kind of grilling issue in the summer, and there might be some coverage there, but now the coverage gets more extensive. Texas Monthly, which has been doing its best list since 1973, but episodically starts doing it more regularly when we get to the late 80s and the 90s. And that's a hugely influential magazine. And so at the very time that you have a large group of people becoming more interested in barbecue because of competitions, what they see on TV and other things, the media that presented them experts that weren't diverse. And part of that is because the people deciding which stories get told were not diverse either. And unless they valued diversity, the same people over and over and over again are presented as experts. And very few, if any, African Americans were presented as experts at this very crucial time, which gets us to that Bon Appetit cover and the Paula Deen show and all of the other things that happen by the time you get to the 1990s and the 2000s. So because of this reorientation away from African Americans, you start to get a redefinition of barbecue. Because in the 1800s, barbecue was whole animal cooking over a trench done by African Americans. And, that was pretty much it. By the time you get to the 1990s, what do you hear as what barbecue is? It's low and slow, meaning you cook it for a long period of time at a low temperature. Now, that's consistent with what we saw in the 1800s, but in the shift from rural barbecue to urban barbecue, I can just tell you a lot of African Americans cook hot, fast, and then slow. And it's a technique that you get down. Use lesser cuts of meat. That is also a reflection of the transition from this rural whole animal cooking to actually focusing on lesser parts, because in an urban context, cooking a whole animal didn't often make that much sense. And so you start to see the rise of just focusing on smaller cuts of meat. And this is an argument that Robert Moss, who is the barbecue editor of Southern Living, made. And I think it's quite compelling because you see it play out in kind of newspaper articles and ads. Now, the upside of focusing on lesser cuts of meat instead of whole animals is you start to get all of these regional specializations. So that kickstarts kind of the regionalization of barbecue, like I described earlier. Minimal seasoning. Now, this is a reflection of fine dining chefs getting in the barbecue game, because before, barbecue was essentially, in times of whole animal cooking, it was essentially this vinegar with red pepper sauce that was added throughout the barbecue process to add a depth of flavor. It was not added at the very end as a condiment. But now folks are saying just use salt and pepper. So the idea of rubs and other things, that's not real barbecue. And then the other thing that just really gets me is the idea that says good barbecue should not have sauce because you want to taste the meat. And I can just tell you a lot of African Americans are sitting there saying, says who? So then I end by talking about barbecue's future. I feature Rodney Scott. He's won a James Beard Award. He's a whole hog enthusiast based in Charleston, South Carolina, but he's expanding to other parts of the country. And so it's really interesting to see whether there's going to be an appetite for whole hog barbecue across the country. But if anybody can pull it off, it's definitely Rodney Scott, because his barbecue is amazing. And also, someone who's doing this is Ed Mitchell, who I talk about in my book. There is Ed Mitchell with his son, Ryan. They were going to launch a whole hog barbecue restaurant in Raleigh, North Carolina, but unfortunately the pandemic has delayed their plans. Hopefully they can launch this summer. But on the right-hand side of the screen is a whole hog barbecue that Ed Mitchell cooked at the Big Apple barbecue party in 2013. And so he brought a taste of authentic whole hog cooking to New York, and people went crazy for it. I know I've had his barbecue, and I can just tell you, it's just really good. And I wish more people could have barbecue, whole hog barbecue by Ed Mitchell and Rodney Scott, because I don't think there would be such an attitude about it. Because a lot of people of all the regional styles that are described, I think a lot of people turn up their nose to North Carolina barbecue because they say, oh, it's just too vinegary. But the problem is that there's a lot of people faking the funk, and they're just not making it well. So they're getting a bad version of North Carolina barbecue. And the other thing that's interesting is this could be a back to the future moment, because if you think about it, whole hog barbecue is one of the most sustainable ways to do this kind of cooking. Let's just go to the meat of the time right now, brisket. Think about all the brisket that's being consumed right now. Well, there's only 2 briskets for every cow. So that just tells you the magnitude of how many cows are being killed to meet that demand. Whole hog barbecue, much like the idea was 200 years ago, you can feed a whole crowd with that stuff and you're using every part of the animal. Well, not every single part, but you know what I'm saying. I also feature the Jones sisters in Kansas City, Deborah and Mary Jones of Jones Barbecue. I got a chance to meet Mary. I'm sorry, Deborah, because Mary wasn't there at the time that I went, but they have rocketed to stardom because they were featured on that show Queer Eye. And I'm really, really happy for them because they're wonderful. They're doing great barbecue and they're in Kansas City, Kansas. And they've got their sauce business that's just taken off after being in that. And again, I love their story because it shows the continuity of women entrepreneurs in African-American barbecue culture. And one of the coolest things they've done is they've created a barbecue vending machine. I mean, how cool is that? So you can get sandwiches and other stuff in their sauce, even when they're not open. I think that's just a stroke of genius. In terms of the future of African-American barbecue, I can tell you right now, the strongest trend is turkey. So turkey is chopped, pulled, hot links, ribs, and turkey tips. So here I'm going to show you are some rib tips from St. Louis. And this is actually the shoulder blade. Meat around the shoulder blade is cut in a way that it resembles a rib. But much like you saw a transition from pork to turkey and soul food in the 1980s and 1990s, you're starting to see that now in barbecue. And I think the idea is just looking for a healthier option. And so in North Carolina, they're doing chopped turkey, East North Carolina style. And seriously, except for the color, the lighter color of the meat, you would never know that it was turkey instead of pork. In Memphis, it's pulled and chopped turkey instead of pulled chopped pork. In Chicago, you're getting turkey tips, hot links made with turkey. And then I just showed you the ribs here. Another possible thing is vegan is one of the strongest trends in African-American food right now. And so you're seeing a lot of plant-based barbecue showing up. One is jackfruit, an Asian fruit that for somebody who knows what they're doing, they can smoke it and sauce it in a way that it mimics the texture and taste of pork. And so you're seeing that in a lot of places. In fact, there's a barbecue joint in Oakland, California called Veg Mob, and it's quite popular. And then I opine about this. I haven't seen this show up in barbecue places, black barbecue places yet. But, you know, the technology is here where we can have lab-grown meat grown out of a test tube, and we could have 3D printed meat. They can already do burgers. And so anything doesn't have a bone, that's the only thing they can't really replicate right now. But they can actually replicate meat. And, you know, if people can get past, you know, mentally and accept that, that could have huge consequences for barbecue and animal welfare and a lot of other things. So, you know, will brothers and sisters be grubbing on Impossible ribs in 10 years? Hey, I don't know, but I just raised the question. And then, you know, I thought that I was going to be writing an elegy, something sad about the demise of African-American barbecue, but actually I'm excited. Barbecue is shifting for African-Americans. You're seeing less brick and mortar places, but there's a lot of food trucks, the brother and sister on the side of the road or in the parking lot. For whatever reason, on a lot of strip clubs. I didn't go deep into that for obvious reasons, but that shows up a lot. But the impromptu barbecue and caterers and all that kind of stuff, I would say that the African-American barbecue scene is thriving in a very shifted way. So I'm excited for barbecue's future. Here's a guy, he's at Bone Goo Barbecue in Miami, Florida, just savoring that barbecue meat. I just love that photo. So my book, Black Smoke, will be out next week, April 27th. You can order from me at soulfoodscholar.com, but check with your local independent bookseller, online booksellers, or also your public libraries. And again, you can find me at Soul Food Scholar. So thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you so much for making us all starving.
Mission accomplished.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we're inviting people to put questions in the chat and we can certainly pass them along to you. I had a couple questions myself. I think for me at least, I mean, I love barbecue, but one of the things I also love about barbecue are the sides. And I wonder if there are any sides that are really influenced by or come out of the African American culture.
So only to the extent that they come out of kind of the shared Southern cooking culture. So, you know, and there is a regionalization to that. I mean, I just didn't have time to get into the side so much, but, you know, you're seeing collards. A lot of Black owned soul food joints will have soul food sides. So you'll see collards in addition to the baked beans and, you know, coleslaw and potato salad. And also the interesting thing is mac and cheese has become a side now. I mean, I think a lot of people walk into a barbecue joint and expect mac and cheese there. So you definitely see those, but otherwise the sides really do, I would say, more hyper local. So for instance, in the Carolinas, it's going to be those hush puppies. It's going to be that slaw. There's something called barbecue hash, you know, the soup, Brunswick stew, in Kentucky, burgoo, you know, so I see a lot more regionalization there and hewing to local tradition.
Do you barbecue yourself?
So I do, but very episodically. I'm much better at eating barbecue than cooking it. And that's because where I live, the fire code won't let me cook with anything except propane gas. And, you know, I'm just not going to do that to a guest. So when I do cook barbecue, it's usually I go to my father's, who's got an old school double barrel oil drum smoker. And so usually that's holiday cooking. But I know once we, you know, open up more after the pandemic, I'm going to definitely get my barbecue game tight because I know that's a lot of the questions I'm going to get on the book tour trail.
Tyler, who is our engineer, Tyler, I'm not seeing questions in the chat. Are you seeing questions? We're still.
Yes, I am getting all of them. So
okay, all right. Tyler's getting all of
them.
Along. Tyler, do you want to share them with me, or do you want to ask them?
I can pass them along to you all. I've been sending them to Adrian in the chat.
Okay. Adrian, if you want to take a look at them.
I can just go down this.
Sure.
Okay. What was the date on the barbecue flyer shown in the slide about the church barbecue? So that was from 1920. And then let's see. Oh, okay. Hey, Scott, thanks for the message, man. Where was your photo from the south side of Chicago taken? So there's a place called Lem's Barbecue. I don't know if you've heard of that place, but it's really cool because they have a aquarium. So it's really small. It's not really a dine-in place. It's built for takeout. But once you come in the door, there's this huge aquarium smoker right there. So it's pretty amazing. Is the book available on Kindle, Amazon? Yes to both. It's not, the only form it's not available in right now is audio. And I think that's because of liability issues. You know, the audio company thought that my voice was too sexy and it could create a lot of accidents if I were to read my book. So just playing. All right. If you purchase again, you sign them. Yes. If you go to Soul Food Scholar, there's in the navigation bar, there's about my books. If you click on Black Smoke, you can order a book there. And there's a line that says autograph ? And please just indicate how you would like me to sign your book. I'm so happy that you'll buy my book that if you want me to say I couldn't have done it without you, I will sign it that way. So just know that. All right, Helen D. What was the role of Black community and coalition building in barbecue culture? So that's a very great question. So I would argue that it was really the idea of how to build community first that kind of leads to barbecue. Because again, it was kind of this whole animal cooking commands community, right? Because you have to basically have a lot of people there. And so during slavery, enslaved people were often treated, quote unquote, to barbecue after some big work project was done. So it was kind of like it was poised or framed as a reward. But when African Americans could barbecue on their own terms, it was looked at, something about social identity and a way to come together. And because you're working together and then you're feasting together. And so it just reinforced what community leaders wanted to happen. And the other thing you have to understand is that in the rural South, because of the economic or the geographic isolation, places like a church were a spiritual center, but they also were a social center. And then that gets transplanted in other parts of the country when we have the Great Migration and people leave the American South for other places. So we see the same dynamic happen over again where people are building community. And so you have church life. Another important way that this community was built and coalition building was political barbecues. In fact, you had a lot of instances where African Americans were being courted by racist Republicans and Democrats, less so much on the Republican side, but definitely racist Democrats in that time, to get their votes. But African Americans were having barbecues on their own. And you have a few examples of African Americans teaming up with poor whites to have barbecues, but the power structure in those areas were not feeling that at all. So usually those barbecues were disrupted. Fast forward to this day, you have so many groups, Black Panthers, others, that often had a barbecue as a way to just bring people together. And then, one other example that was more recent is, if y'all remember in 2018, I believe, the woman who called the police on the group that was barbecuing in Oakland's Merritt Lake Park, the response from the community to have a black wall barbecuing event, hundreds of people turned out and turned a negative situation into something very positive. So all kinds of continuity going all the way back to the period of slavery. And then the other important thing to note is that quite a few slave rebellions were planned at barbecues because it was a chance to be together without a high degree of white surveillance. And so there was a lot of barbecues planned. So much so that there was talk in newspapers about, hey, y'all should ban barbecues. You should not let Black people have their own barbecues. That's how fearful people were in that time. All right, given them white media's wide focus on barbecue experts, do you have any recommendations for barbecuers that we could watch and learn about their method, learn how to barbecue, etc.? Yeah, so some people that I think are doing a great job, that you want to look at is there's a few videos of Mr. Gates, Ollie Gates, to the extent that Ed Mitchell, and he's doing whole hog barbecue, please watch him. You've got Rodney Scott, who is doing some things. There's also a guy named Kevin Bloodsoe, and also a guy named Matt Horn. Those are the people that I'm thinking about right now, who might have content. Other than that, I can't think of anybody offhand who's actually, teaching and sharing the way that guys like Aaron Franklin and others are. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I think one of the reasons why Aaron Franklin is one of the most recognized barbecue people on the planet is he was very shrewd. He just said, okay, I'm good at something. I'm just going to teach people how to do this and let them do it on their own. And he is the most recognizable barbecue guy, I would say. And my anecdotal proof of that is I was in Italy a couple of years ago, and I was at this barbecue, but more like social barbecue, hamburgers, hot dogs. And I met this guy from Brussels, and we're talking, and he says, yeah, I'm really into barbecue. And I said, you are? And he said, yeah, I made a brisket. I said, you did? And he said, yeah, let me show you. So he pulls out his phone and he shows me a picture of a beautiful brisket. I mean, beautiful. I said, where did you learn how to make that? And he's like, oh, I'm just watching Aaron Franklin's videos. And so, message to Black entrepreneurs. I think if you share your process, you don't have to give away all your secrets, but if you share your process, I think you could definitely build a following and build your stature in the barbecue world, because that's what people are looking for. There's so much information now on how to make good barbecue that, I think people need to wade in and show a distinctive African-American style. Okay. Can you elaborate on the term pitmaster? So yeah, the term pitmaster really emerges in the 1950s. You would think that it went way back, but based on my research, in the 1800s, what they would call somebody who was in charge of a barbecue, they would call them superintendent. So you were superintending over a barbecue, or they would call them just the barbecue chef or the barbecue cook or the barbecue man. So this idea of pitmasters is really something later. Now, there is anecdotal evidence that African Americans were called pit boys because the racial etiquette at the time would not let you call an African American a man. And so boy was the moniker. I just didn't see a lot of evidence of that. So I'm going to keep researching that. But it seems to me like that's a more recent term. So even though it's cringeworthy because it evokes slavery and other things, I don't think that phrase is actually rooted in slavery. It's just something that emerges later. Okay, Adrian is speaking my language today. Did we see African-American cooks cross into some of the high society caterers that you would see in the early 1900s to 2000s and later? So yeah, you do see that, but more, you see it in the restaurant context, but for sure. But yeah, African-Americans were sent to cater elite events all over the South. And actually, I should say all over the country. So very wealthy people. I mean, like, like the R.J. Reynolds family, the tobacco people. There's stories about Adam Scott, who was a legendary African-American barbecue in North Carolina, being sent to cater their barbecue. So that was definitely something you see. But I didn't see it as a regular business from African-Americans. It seems like the wealthy people reached out to somebody who had a reputation in the community. So rather than an established business, I think it was just like, if you're going to do a barbecue and you were wealthy, you would just tap that person. What are some other favorite vegan barbecue items other than jackfruit? What I'm seeing besides jackfruit is roots. So burdock and lotus root. And so what people are doing is they're cutting those in a way that they either resemble a rib tip or a rib, and then they're smoking it and then putting it in a nice sauce. So, a lot of people are going to fight, is that really barbecue? But it tasted good. So it's definitely something that I would have again. But I see jackfruit the most. Now, here's an interesting tidbit on jackfruit. Talking to barbecue people here in Denver, because there was a moment where you were seeing jackfruit all over the place. They don't really serve it that much anymore because they told me it just doesn't move. So, and even in a place like Colorado, which is known for being super healthy, right? They're just saying jackfruit is just not, it's not that popular. So it may be more among home cooks, but I just don't know. One funny story about jackfruit. The first time I had it was in Boulder, Colorado, and the guy was selling me on it. And the way he sold me on it, because I was very skeptical, and he said, look, man, there was a vegan barbecue contest or convention down the street, and a lot of vegans came in here and they told me, they don't want meat, they just want bread, sauce, whatever. And I said, well, I have this thing called jackfruit, and I convinced them to order it. And the vegans were sending back the jackfruit because they were convinced it tastes like pork. And I said, all right, sold. And I tried it, and I was like, you know what? I could see why they did that. So if vegans get mad because they think it's meat, then it's good stuff. It's a good substitute. Michael, hey, thanks for that message about grateful for the research. I really appreciate that. Yes, thanks for the praise here and today. In terms of future of barbecue, do you see food media changing, especially major media outlets, to make it more equitable anytime soon? I see some small changes like the Netflix special you mentioned, just not seeing it across the board. Yeah, we're seeing seedlings of hope, but there's going to there's a lot that's going to have to happen in order to change this media depiction of African Americans, because it's just not where it should be. But you're seeing changes. And one thing, I know that Rodney Scott has a cookbook, and then Kevin Bloodsoe, the guy I mentioned earlier, is coming out with a cookbook. But believe it or not, these are the first time in 25 years. These cookbooks will be the first time in 25 years that an African American who's an actual practitioner of this culinary craft got a cookbook deal. What's up with that? So we'll just have to see what happens. Korean barbecue is pretty popular in LA. Is it popular anywhere else? Oh no, Korean barbecue you see all over the place. It's popular in Denver, so it's definitely trendy. Korean barbecue is hot right now, so you see it all over the place. Do you have hope for barbecue to evolve to remain traditional in its flavors, methods, and its ability to gather communities? Oh, absolutely. I have hope in all three of those things. So I think it's the very nature of cuisine and food to change over time. I mean, you want some traditional elements because I think people like to feel this connection to the past, but it's just the nature of things to change. And I think barbecue is changing in very interesting ways now, driven a lot by technology. I talked about the meat side of the technology, but the cooking technology has allowed barbecue to be produced on a much more massive scale than, say, 100 years ago. Because 100 years ago, you would just cook a pig and start selling it, and once that ran out, that was it. But now you can make a ton of food in one sitting, and it can, if a chef knows what they're doing, they can make it taste like it just came off the pit. That's not the easiest thing to do. LBJ was known for his barbecue. Anything on those events? Yeah. So, LBJ had a cook named Walter Jatan, who helped him, and Walter Jatan also had Black assistants. And so, yeah, he was known for a lot of barbecue events. In fact, in 1964, when he was running for president on his own for the first time, he and his daughters actually had a series of barbecue events around the country. And I know one was planned for New York City. I just don't know if it ever came off. But my favorite LBJ barbecue event was the barbecue state dinner that he had for the president of Mexico at his ranch in Central Texas. And there's a lot of pictures of that. And so it was traditional kind of hill country barbecue. So beef, sausages, and some other things, but I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, I love LBJ for having barbecue diplomacy. Okay, I think I hit all of the questions. I don't know if I missed any. Any more questions?
Well, Adrian, I just can't thank you enough for your time today. It has been just a delight. And the thing that always makes me sad with the Zoom calls is that you can't hear people laughing when you say something funny. But we were laughing. We were with you there.
All right, good.
So, a huge thank you to you. And if people do still have questions, they can probably email you or reach out to you on your website. So I want to thank you again, thank our hosts at the Ann Arbor District Library. Remind folks that next month our program will take place on May 16th, 4:00 Eastern. Our speaker will be Mr. Oswald Rivera. His topic is Puerto Rican cuisine in America. And you can check our website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, for details on how to attend. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you again, Adrian, and everyone enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.